Imagine a glowing book with your name. It opens in a library wider than galaxies. Angels hold quills of fire. They write your first breath. They write your first heartbeat. They record your first cry. They inscribe your first smile. They capture your first tear. They note your first word. They shine your first prayer. They mark your first lie. They trace your first kindness. They etch your first sin. They write your first dream. They inscribe your first fear. They record your first promise. They write your first betrayal. They capture your first act of love. They note your first act of hate. They shine your first gift. They scar your first greed. They inscribe your first courage. They record your first weakness. They trace your first blessing. They mark your first curse. They write your first victory. They inscribe your first failure. They capture your first sacrifice. They note your first selfishness. They shine your first gratitude. They darken your first bitterness. They record your first truth. They write your first lie again. They inscribe your first mercy. They trace your first cruelty. They capture your first secret prayer. They mark your first hidden sin. They write your first moment of faith. They record your first hour of doubt. They shine your first song of joy. They scar your first scream of anger. They inscribe your first humble act. They note your first prideful boast. They record your first friendship built. They write your first friendship broken. They capture your first hope spoken. They mark your first despair whispered. They trace your first love shown. They scar your first hatred spread. They inscribe your first courage to forgive. They write your first refusal to forgive. They record your first hand extended. They mark your first hand withheld. They capture your first blessing received. They darken your first blessing ignored. They shine your first light embraced. They scar your first shadow chosen. They inscribe your first truth defended. They record your first lie protected. They write your first heart healed. They mark your first heart broken. They capture your first strength used well. They scar your first strength abused. They inscribe your first holy thought. They record your first corrupt thought. They shine your first gentle word. They scar your first cruel word. They trace your first act of justice. They mark your first compromise with evil. They record your first hunger for God. They write your first hunger for sin. They inscribe your first night of peace. They scar your first night of rebellion. They capture your first sunrise of hope. They mark your first sunrise of despair. They trace your first silent trust. They darken your first silent doubt. They record your first blessing spoken. They scar your first curse shouted. They shine your first kindness unseen. They darken your first cruelty unnoticed. They inscribe your first faith against odds. They scar your first surrender to fear. They capture your first moment of grace. They mark your first moment of guilt. They record your first step into light. They scar your first step into shadow. They write your first thought of heaven. They scar your first thought of rebellion. They inscribe your first praise of God. They record your first denial of Him. They shine your first selfless act. They scar your first selfish act. They trace your first word of hope. They scar your first word of despair. They capture your first promise kept. They scar your first promise broken. They inscribe your first moment of repentance. They record your first moment of pride. They shine your first gentle embrace. They scar your first act of rejection. They write your first time you lifted another. They scar your first time you crushed another. They record your first holy desire. They scar your first sinful longing. They inscribe your first joy in worship. They mark your first mockery of worship. They capture your first prayer in tears. They scar your first curse in rage. They trace your first giving in secret. They scar your first boasting and pride. They inscribe your first hunger for righteousness. They scar your first hunger for vanity. They record your first step of faith. They scar your first step of doubt. They shine your first surrender to God. They scar your first surrender to sin. They inscribe your first night of trust. They scar your first night of rebellion. They record your first battle won. They scar your first battle lost. They inscribe your first act of mercy. They scar your first act of cruelty. They record your first truth whispered. They scar your first lie shouted. They inscribe